Good afternoon. Welcome to the Web Shell Hunting Workshop. I'm Joe Schottman. This is AppSec Village at DEF CON Safe Mode, August 8th, 2020. A little bit about me. I'm a Senior Security Analyst for Truist, formerly BB&T. I've been most recently focused in application security, but I've also done work in incident response, vulnerability management. I've done purple team engagements. I've written web applications. I've run the systems that they ran on, and I've tied them together using DevOps techniques. I'm pretty enterprisey. I work for a very large organization and previously worked for a very large university. I'm used to thinking in terms of millions of users and thousands of servers running hundreds of applications. If you're in a smaller environment that's more tightly controlled, some of this will seem pretty basic to you, or that it would be something that wouldn't be a challenge at all. But when you start working at large scales, your attack surface is so large that there's a lot of opportunities for attackers to get in and use web shells. The obligatory disclaimer: I'm not speaking on behalf of Truist, BB&T, or any other entity. All opinions expressed are my own. All images in the presentation are believed to be public domain. Sample code is presented under fair use. All other content is copyright 2020. The agenda for this portion of the presentation: we're going to cover what is a web shell. We're going to talk about how web shells work, then talk a little bit about how they can be detected. A few definitions for this talk. I'm going to use the term web server and application server interchangeably. In some cases, a web server would more specifically just be something like Apache that might serve static content. That's not something that a web shell works with, so we're just going to use the term interchangeably. Also, for English nerds, I recognize that web shell is not a proper noun, but I'm going to treat it as one as far as capitalization for this presentation. If you're playing DEF CON buzzword bingo, you'll get at least 3 words from this talk. Before I go into exactly what a web shell is, I'm going to take a brief diversion and explain why I started researching the presentation. The Equifax breach is probably familiar to everyone watching this. It's one of the largest known data breaches in history. The initial attack vector was the March 2017 Struts2 vulnerability. Mandiant was called in to do the incident response and concluded that the attackers had used 30 different web shells on the 2 compromised servers. These were used for both the post-exploitation and exfiltration and could have been used to regain access had they lost access via the Struts2 vulnerability. It got a lot of press, obviously, things that C-level executives were reading, and things like this explain that even if the Struts2 vulnerability had been remediated, the attacker still could have gotten back in using the web shells. More recently this spring, the NSA put out an advisory saying that they had seen an uptick in use of web shells. There's no conclusive proof of who it was or what they were doing, but generally when the NSA starts waving the signal flag like this, there's something going on. They published a list of software that they had seen compromised using and having web shells put on it. If you work in a large organization, chances are you have a few of these inside your environment, most notably the SharePoint vulnerability from 2019. Microsoft also talked about how they were called in to do incident response on one of these compromised SharePoint systems. There's a large paper that they have on this linked at the bottom if you want to explore that. So what is a web shell? A web shell is a type of malware that runs on application servers. It's someone else's code running on your server that you don't intend to be there for malicious purposes. It can be used to plunder this local system. They might just be grabbing local files. It can be used to backdoors/persistence, like what Mandiant was talking about. It could be a general purpose remote access tool. If they've installed a crypto miner, for example, they might use it to administer it. It's very often used for pivoting from your external network into your internal network, and it's very often used for exfiltration of data. Web servers normally talk to the internet and send it things, so it's a great place to slip things that are easy to detect in other forms of exfiltration that might be missed. They're used by a lot of APT groups. Here's a few that MITRE has mapped using the attack framework to different APT groups, but they're also used by script kiddies. They don't necessarily require a high degree of skill to use or install. You can find a ton of them on GitHub and other locations. It's easier to catch a script kiddie than an APT, but the same techniques apply to both. Like I said, it's someone else's code. It's written in the language or languages that your web server supports. In some cases where a server supports multiple languages, I've seen, for example, some that would support Python, PHP, and Perl simultaneously. You'll find web shells dropped on the same system that you use each language. You'll find them written in almost every code form of language out there. Most web shells are written in scripting language. They're easiest to drop on servers like that. You'll find web shells written in ASP or JSP rather than full jar files. But an attacker can certainly build a complex war file and install it on someone's Tomcat server. It just raises the complexity of the attack. The big thing that they do is they control your server via HTTP or HTTPS. They're used to execute commands, access files, exfiltrate them. They can very often are used to access databases and gather information from them. And they can be used to query system information to find information about other vulnerabilities that might be possible to use against it, and that sort of thing. Basically, just conceptualize an evil web application. They often use the programming language as built-in functionality as much as possible for things like file access. When the language doesn't have easy support for the functionality, they sometimes will just execute as a raw command. A good author will try to avoid using this because that's fairly easy to detect. In some cases, they may install command shell utilities to do tasks. They execute just like your web application. This is good and bad. It runs with the same permissions and limitations as your web server. Some groups will use escalation tools in conjunction with web shells, but unless the application server is modified, the web shell executes just like your code. This is used for hunting them. Unless the attacker takes specific countermeasures, all files created by the web shell will be owned by the application server. File creation modification times will be accurate, but in some cases, a sophisticated attacker will use time stomping to cover the tracks of that. Access to the web shell will appear in the application server logs. Child processes will show up as being owned by the application server process. So if it's unusual, something like command.exe or bash that is not normally run from your application server, if you do a PS tree, you can see things as a dead giveaway that something unusual is happening. If they're using the built-in languages to access other web servers within your organization, web requests will tend to have the same default user agent as application server unless they specifically override that. They have multiple uses. Sometimes they're used overtly for command and control. In some cases, they kick off to a completely different channel, so they might drop a web shell and then use that to connect out through Netcat. Sometimes it's not used at all. They'll install it and never use it. It's just sitting there as a sleeper agent, and they hope that if you find them and kick them off of the network and their main ways of getting into it, months or even a year down the line, they might be able to use that web shell to get back in and start pivoting around again. Web shells can be hidden in a number of ways. In some cases, they might masquerade as a legitimate file. So it might be a legitimate file name, but in a slightly different path. They might find a legitimate file that's simply not used very often by that web application and replace it entirely. It might appear to be just a random executable file like system.aspx. Sometimes the code is inserted into legitimate files. In some cases, they hide the information in image files. This was mostly only in PHP that could be configured to execute image code found within image files. It's very common to present itself to web users as harmless content or even a 404 unless provided with a password. So you might see something suspicious in the log that looks a little bit funny and go to it, and unless you're providing a hidden password, you're just going to see something that looks normal. An attacker may modify the server to execute non-standard files as an application. So this can be going into the Apache config and saying to execute certain types of files that are not an extension that would not normally be executed as PHP, and to go ahead and execute them as PHP. There was a really cute, mostly patched vulnerability where they figured out a way to run PHP code from an .htaccess file. So that was used in one case to create a web shell. I mentioned earlier that web shells often use some kind of authentication. This is generally obfuscated in some way. They don't want to have an obvious get or post variable that looks like it's a password, both in terms of the name of the variable and the data inside of it. So the name will be something that looks innocuous, and the data, the password itself, might be something that looks like it could be used by a web application, or it could just be something that's Base64 encoded or encrypted. Sometimes there'll be a special user agent that's necessary to access the application. Sometimes they will have to have a specific refer header. And in both of those cases, again, the information can be specially encoded or encrypted rather than just in plain text. Sometimes there's an IP whitelist if they know a specific range that they're going to be operating from. And in some cases, they will add an extra HTTP header, though that's fairly unusual because that's something that sticks out easily in a WAF. A more professional group will typically use 2 or more of these, although there's certainly many examples of APT groups using just a single one. How do web shells get onto systems in the first place? One of the really common ones is a file upload attack. If there's any way that the attacker can upload a file to the system in a way that it gets written to the web root and executed, that's a really simple way to execute a web shell attack. If there's a remote inclusion attack where the system will actually load code from a malicious system, that's another way to gain access. In some cases, the SQL injection will be used. If the SQL server has the ability to write files, you can use that to write a web shell to the web root. They very often use insecure administrative interfaces. This could be something like a cPanel or just brute forcing the access to your WordPress admin account. Most of the time, once you have some kind of administrative access like that, it's relatively easy to write a new file to the file system. If they've executed a different type of attack, such as the struts2 attack mentioned with Equifax, they can use that to start dropping files onto the system or cause it to do a wget and pull a web shell down onto the system. And if they've attacked the server through some other means, say they're pivoting around on an internal network and gain access to a web server through compromising a system administrator's account, they can use that to start dropping web shells on systems that were not previously compromised. Why do attackers use web shells? In the good old days when I was starting in security, there was not a whole lot of good boundaries on networks. You could often get access to an entire network through Samba that was internet facing, or SMB. At this point, things are pretty well locked down, and most of the time attackers have 3 main ways of getting into a large enterprise. The first that you're probably very familiar with is phishing. It's probably the most common way of getting into large businesses. The next is guessable passwords with external logins. This could be things like OWA, the Outlook web interface that's got a single factor. You use that to gain access and then start plundering email to find different ways to get into the systems. But then the third way is application servers, and that's where the web shells come in. Breaching the perimeter with web shells is really powerful. There's a couple reasons why this has some strong advantages. The first is that web servers are expected to generally have a pretty good amount of traffic. If you breach some random system that happens beyond the internet but doesn't really do a whole lot that's consumer facing, if there's a sudden spike in traffic from it to the there's a couple reasons why web shells are really useful for breaching the perimeter. The first is that web traffic is generally expected. If you have a web server that's online and a corporation, it's generally expected to do a fairly good amount of traffic every day. Whereas if you breach a random system that happens beyond the internet but doesn't do something that's consumer facing, if there's a giant spike in traffic from it to the internet, that's something that's pretty easily to get noticed. The second is that TLS encryption makes it harder to use the tools that many of the standard blue team members are used to using to defend the systems. Unless you have the ability to terminate your TLS before the IDS, IPS, or next generation firewall, it's just going to sail through as encrypted data that it has no visibility into. The 2 possible solutions to this are either to terminate the TLS before the firewall, IDS, IPS, and give it the visibility then re-encrypt it possibly on the way to the web server, or to use a WAF, a web application firewall, which is basically a very fine-tuned IDS system that has both the ability to do the TLS termination and has a lot of specific rules designed for web attacks that may not exist inside IDSs. The third is that production websites can generate a lot of logs, which makes it harder to find attacks within them. At a previous employer, I had roughly 100 gigabytes of Apache logs generated every single day from non-malicious use. So if there was a few dozen malicious web shell connections in there, it was very hard to find them. And lastly, developers do some very interesting things when they write their code. It's not necessarily anything that creates a vulnerability or anything that's done maliciously to violate security, but I've seen interesting use of what looks like SQL and all kinds of cookie parameters that can cause things like detuning the WAF to cut down on the false positive rate. They can allow true positives to sail right on through. Once the attacker's inside the perimeter, that doesn't mean that they aren't going to keep deploying new web shells on new systems. They can, once they start pivoting around to other internal systems, if they attack another internal web server, they're probably going to drop a web shell on it if possible. This can be useful for regaining access. Again, if they happen to get in through phishing rather than getting in through the web perimeter, chances are they'll be able to phish someone else again, and having that web shell sitting there in that system can be useful for them to start pivoting around it once again. It can be useful for VLAN hopping or chaining between different systems. If you can compromise a web server that has access to an IP range that the desktop users don't, you can start using that to start getting deeper and deeper inside the network. In some cases, I've seen multiple web shells talking to multiple web shells talking to multiple web shells to get deep inside the network. There's a lot of softer targets on the inside that makes it a good place to start dropping your web shells, especially things like test servers. They may not have the standard security tooling, and they may not be logging to the production SIM, so they might be going to a test SIM, or they may not be having their logs analyzed at all. How are the attackers using the web shells once they have them in place? In some cases, it's pre-configured commands. It's very easy. There might be a drop-down menu that says, do a user enumeration, do an Nmap scan, that kind of thing. In some cases, you just pass it the executable code of whatever language it's programmed in. So it might take Python, it might take PHP, etc., and you just tell it what you want it to do specifically. Or it may just send a simple command to execute the shell script. And so that's noisy, but very easy to slip in as a one-liner. Some web shells are, on the other hand, are surprisingly sophisticated. There's China Chopper is one of the notable example. It has a complete Windows GUI front end. It supports ASP, JSP, and Cold Fusion applications. It has multiple capabilities. It will actually do vulnerability scanning, looking for other things that can be exploited on the system. All kinds of file management, interfacing with databases as a database manager, and then a standard web terminal so that you can start doing whatever you want with arbitrary commands. One thing to keep in mind that web shells are never the initial attack. If you find a web shell on a system, you have at least two problems. Why at least two problems? First, there's the initial vector, whatever allowed them to get the web shell on the system in the first place. This might be something simple like a file upload vulnerability, but it's something that needs to be remediated. Second, there's the web shell that you found that needs to be cleaned up. Third, there may be more additional web shells. It's very common to put more than one on a system so that if you find and terminate the first one, they have alternate ways of getting back in. In some cases, during a live incident, they may be dropping additional web shells as you find and terminate specific ones. As mentioned earlier, if the server has the ability to run more than one type of application, they may be switching up languages during this process to try to avoid detection. Let's consider where web shells are used. There's two common frameworks for understanding the processes followed by attackers in many serious attacks. There's a cyber kill chain created by Lockheed Martin and attack created by MITRE. The cyber kill chain has a shorter number of steps. It's kind of fallen out of favor with attack taking over, but it's still useful for understanding some of the processes that attackers do. These are the steps used by them, and these are the steps where web shells are useful. They don't really come in the pre-attack, the weaponization of the first vulnerability, the delivery of the vulnerability's exploit, and triggering the exploit, but they do come with the installation of additional tools on the system, the command and control, taking advantage and controlling the system that you've compromised to do other things, and then taking the actual actions on the objectives. Generally, simply placing the web shell or compromising a server isn't the target that an attacker has. They're after the information in the database. They're trying to drop a crypto miner. They're trying to drop ransomware. This is what the web shells are really good for. Attack has more stages. It's a little bit different, but here are the stages within it that it's useful for. It's used for persistence, for maintaining access and regaining it. It's used for privilege escalation because it can do things and look around on the system for a vulnerability that might let them get root or /admin access. It's used for accessing credentials that are stored on the system, discovering other systems on the network, moving into them, collecting the information that is actually the thing that they're after, exfiltrating it in some cases. In the Equifax case, for example, they both dropped some of the files onto the web's root and simply downloaded it, but they also downloaded some exclusively through the web root, through the web shell, and just taking general command and control over the system to accomplish all these objectives. This is an example of the MITRE ATT&CK framework that you've probably seen by now. It divides those categories into subcategories and explains specific TTPs, tactics, techniques, and procedures that they'll use to perform those tasks. You'll find web shells are used for several of them. If you've not seen this, I do recommend checking out the MITRE ATT&CK framework. So as you start dealing with a web shell, you're not just dealing with an attack. You're now into the mode where you need to be dealing with incident response. If you find a web shell on a system and you're not part of the incident response team, you need to check to see if your company has an IR policy and/or team that needs to be engaged. This is needed for a couple reasons. First, taking a forensic image of the drive will allow things like recovering deleted files and looking at the timestamp information that may not be surfaced to standard users. If you're not part of that team, you may not have the ability to do this. If you start sleuthing around, it may tip off the attacker that you're onto them. This can give them time to wipe the traces of the attack, or do something like wipe the entire server, or trigger something like in the last phases of a ransomware attack that might be escapable if the IR team is the one intervening. There may be a legal requirement, depending on your industry, that as soon as there's a certain level of incident, you have to do so. And proper cleanup means that you have to start figuring out every system that computer might have also compromised. If you don't have access to all the different systems within the network, all of the different security tools, you're probably not the ideal person to be tackling it. As a funny aside, there's a Metasploit module that takes advantage of an existing web shell's ability to run commands on systems and uses that to execute commands rather than using something like Meterpreter. There's also been cases where attackers will go and scan for other web shells that may have been dropped by a different attacker that's using a default password and use that to gain systems that they didn't gain access to initially. Metasploit itself has a couple examples of web shells within it, but it's generally not a big web shell tool. On to detecting web shells. There's a couple different strategies we can use for this. The first basic thing is you can have some defense for your antivirus, anti-malware systems. It's not going to catch a lot, it's not going to catch everything, but if you do at least some basic tuning and then feed examples to it during an incident, you can help yourself. File integrity monitoring is huge with this. Different things you can do on the file system itself, looking inside files, doing an analysis and exams of the log files, preferably within a SIM, looking at the network traffic itself, and then your tools that do endpoint anomaly detection. Starting with the antivirus, anti-malware, most AV products can find some web shells. It's not going to find a lot of them, but it's better than nothing. It's very often looking for simple hash of a known file, or looking for a few specific lines of interpret language that's indicative of that specific web shell. It's easy to fool the engine by just changing the file enough to change the hash, or to take those key lines. For example, you can actually split some Python into two separate lines and trick some pretty well-known AV engines into no longer detecting the web shell. It's still better than nothing. And if you do find a new web shell during an incident and it's not detected by your AV, it's sometimes worth taking the time to feed it and creating a detection so that your AV engine on all your systems will find other examples of it. Another way that antivirus comes into play with web shells is if you're doing research on a machine that has antivirus installed, you're probably going to get about a 20 to 30% response rate if you download a large sample, and you'll end up with having your samples quarantined or possibly deleted. This includes some of the large cloud storage providers as well. If you are doing research on this on a corporate machine, make sure that you have specific permission to do so, or otherwise you might be getting a call from the SOC after they get a number of antivirus alerts on your system. The best thing to do, of course, is to have a separate virtual machine that you do the research inside of. And I'm sure that everyone watching this gets permission before doing research, right? One thing that some people do is they'll upload a web shell or any piece of malware to VirusTotal. I don't particularly recommend this for a couple reasons. The first is that once you've identified a web shell and start looking at the code, it's almost always pretty obvious that there's something unusual and malicious going on, so you're not really gaining any benefit from saying, is this detectable or not? Another reason is that some attackers do monitor VirusTotal, so if all of a sudden they know that if they have a distinct piece of malware that they're using on your environment and it's showing up as having been found, they know that the game is afoot. And lastly, if you make a mistake and the file is not malicious and it turns out to be your company's intellectual property, uploading it to a third party may be a career-limiting move. One of the strongest defenses against web shells is file integrity monitoring. If you have a robust DevOps process, your system for deploying your applications and maintaining them may be capable of doing this, detecting any kind of changes, alerting you, and rolling back. There's also tools like TripWire that are a tool that will sit there, generate the hashes of the known good files, and keep an ongoing log of that and show you that when anything has changed. You can also roll your own by just going through and recursively searching through your web files and taking hashes and storing it off the system. The off the system is important just in case they do gain access to all of the system and they could hypothetically find those hashes and modify them. If you don't have the ability to do either of those and you think that you've got a compromised system, but you have the ability to deploy the software to a new known good system, you can also do that, generate the hashes, and then do the comparison that way. In an ideal world, your application would not allow file uploads, but that's not actually practical for many real-world applications, so if you must allow it, take some steps to protect it. Restrict the file types that are allowed to be uploaded. If it's an image upload function, there's absolutely no reason why the JSP or PHP code should ever be allowed. So if that's detected, and don't just rely on the file extension, actually look at what's inside the file, throw it away, and send up an alert. Don't allow arbitrary names. If you have to keep an arbitrary name for the file, store it as separate metadata rather than allowing the attacker to specify what the name should be. Scan it with an antivirus tool. It's not going to find everything, but it's better than nothing. And getting some clue that someone's trying to attack your web server by uploading a web shell is useful information to say what else they're doing. And store the uploaded files outside of the web root. Most of these tools work by being able to be executed by the web application server, and that's generally restricted to a specific subdirectory or two. If you're storing the files outside of that, even if they can get something malicious in there, it's just going to sit there and not execute. Also, in an ideal world, if you can keep the entire web root read-only, again, all of this type of attack works by being able to write a executable file to someplace where the web server will execute it. If all of that is read-only, they're dead in the water. Many container strategies with immutable storage as an inherent facet are a big component in helping cut down on this. Conduct file integrity monitoring testing. Do testing randomly where you put files. They don't even have to be malicious on the web server, someplace where they shouldn't be, and see how long it takes for anyone or any process to notice. The APT groups that are using web shells are getting very rapid at moving from one system to another. Once they get that first beachhead, they go on to the second, third, fourth system very quickly, and getting your response time down to minutes is important. There's a framework being pushed by one of the IR companies called the 11060 framework, where ideally that you should have tooling that can detect something malicious happening within 1 minute. A human analyst, if needed, should be able to respond to it within 10 minutes and start working the case. And within 60 minutes, you should be able to take some kind of corrective response. There's other file system techniques you can use besides file system monitoring. You can search for the hashes of known web shells. This could be both things that you find online that you add to your rules to look for, but especially once you have an incident and you've found one, take that hash and make sure you have a system that can query all your different servers to look for that particular hash, just in case they got sloppy and dropped that same one elsewhere. This can also be useful on load balance systems where they may have gotten access to more than one system and put on 2 or 3 different systems that are very similar. Look for unusual file modification times. If you have a good deployment strategy where everything's written by a deployment tool and the modification time should be basically the same time for everything, if there's something that's a 2-month later timestamp, that's worth checking out. As I mentioned earlier, there's a concept called time stomping, which will modify what this looks like in most things like command.exe, but it's worth keeping an eye out for nonetheless. Search for unusual file locations. If there's a directory that doesn't make sense to be where it is, that sort of thing. They might be looking for a legitimate directory name and putting it as a different subdirectory to hope to go unnoticed. You can utilize any number of shell scripts or threat hunting tools. There's various products specifically for threat hunting for web shells. There's shell scripts for doing so, Python, Bash, etc. All of these are of limited use if the attacker makes sure that each web shell they deploy is distinct, but this is all about defense in depth. No one of these things is going to be the complete panacea for everything, but build a practice that has a number of different things so you can make sure that you get that little hint of a needle so you can pick it up and start following the thread. As I mentioned earlier, you may need to do some serious file system forensics. If you locate a web shell through different means other than a forensic examination, you may need to have a forensic analyst image the system and start looking at what happened as far as deleted files. There's some very interesting things that you'll find as you go back in time. The attackers will do things that lets you do attribution, cover it over, etc. So you don't want to be thinking just in terms of the file system as it exists right now. Dirty word lists can be very useful for hunting for web shells. As you find each new web shell, look for anything that's unique and identifying within it and add it to your dirty words list. It's a concept in incident response where you have an ongoing list that you keep adding to of anything that's unique that you find that could be indicative of suspicious activity within a file. You add to it on an ongoing basis, and if necessary, loop back to files earlier that you had searched with a partial list and search again with a more expanded list because you'll find things that you missed earlier. It can be things that are completely suspicious like code samples and snippets. So look for things like, if you're working with PHP, exec or shell exec are used to execute shell commands. Unless there's a very good reason why your program should ever be using those, and in general they shouldn't, having those within a PHP file is pretty indicative that it could be a web shell. It can also be things like people's names, email addresses. You'll find that certain people like to put little brags within their code. If you're working against an adversary that speaks a foreign language, there may be certain words in that language that appear. So just compile this and keep adding to it again and again. Ideally, you want to have a tool that can start looking at whether a file contains multiple cases of different words. So a particular word might be innocent in and of itself once, but if it appears 3 or 4 times and in conjunction with a second word is really suspicious. That's not to say that you're not going to get good value out of a tool like grep. A lot of the time you do need to just dive to the shell and start digging around very quickly using tools like that, but get familiar with a more powerful tool that can do that sort of searching. Let's look at some examples of web shells. Laudanum is an open source collection of web shells created by Secure Ideas. They are technically usable as offensive tools, but they're mostly as proof of concept, showing the ideas and how they work. They are pretty easy to detect and do not take great strides to try to be hard to find. Here's an example of some very simple words you could add to a dirty word list. The word shell, the name PHP shell, the specific name of this tool, and laudanum, the name of the collection. This might seem like ridiculously easy things, but you'd be surprised how many times attackers will just use a tool without bothering to customize it or obfuscating it at all. A little bit more sophisticated, I've highlighted proc open here. That's one of the commands that's really commonly used by web shells. That's not the previous things. They can cut out the comments, they can rename things to be less obvious, etc. But to actually function, you have to have proc open. So that's something that's much more reliable to add to your dirty words list. Here's the shell.aspx, the .NET version equivalent. There's CMD is something that's easy to search for. And the comparable thing to the shell exec is the system.diagnostics process start info. So again, they can take out the comments and make it less obvious, but if they need to run a shell command, they're going to have to do so eventually. Look for files with large amounts of encrypted or encoded content within the file itself. The attackers will often take the core of what the application does and either encrypt or encode it using things like Base64. This hides it from being able to be findable with string searches, but they still have to have a framework that will take that and decode it, decrypt it, etc. So that is a key thing to be able to search for. And if there's not a good reason for your programmers to be putting things stored within Base64 within a file, having large amounts of Base64 content is suspicious. There's not a lot of reason to have a high entropy within a file, one that's executable by the web application server. Again, that's something that you can search for and flag on. Here's a Base64 example of encoding a part of the laudanum. So again, your grep isn't going to be able to find something like this, but if you have a tool that will look for either large amounts of Base64 or take that Base64 and reverse it, then you can start figuring out what's going on, or flag the file as suspicious. Here's the AES encrypted version of the same thing. As I said, obfuscated code still has to execute. So even if they have 99% of the code hidden, there still has to be some kind of eval or assert type command that takes that and then takes the code and then runs it. So encourage your programmers not to use things like this in the code unless there's an excellent reason to do so, because that means you can add it to your search tools as a strong indicator that there's been a compromise. Another thing that you can use besides the eval type commands is using deserialization libraries to make it a little bit more sneaky. Yara is an example of a tool that has malware research and detection capabilities that I was talking about earlier, the ability to search for multiple things at the same time. Its primary function is searching based on text or binary patterns, but there's also rules for things like file size or location of strings within files. It has a number of rules available for web shell detection for the common web shells, so you don't have to reinvent the wheel. Yara is a clever internet acronym that if you want to find out, you can look it up. There's also another similar tool called OpenIOC. Here's an example of a Yara rule that looks for the Weebly web shell. It has a number of strings that it looks for, but then it also has some conditions that look for a specific file size restriction and PHP. When you're doing incident response or threat hunting for web shells, don't forget to look in databases. Some web shells use databases to store the information that they're gathering about systems, to gather information that they're planning on exfiltrating, or to actually have some of the code that they intend to execute to hide it from things like grep. Consider what your tooling is to look for new or unexpected databases or tables, or ones that are growing way beyond what they're supposed to. If you have good database tooling, consider your ability to look for different data types that are outside of the norm within a database table. So if you have a varchar that's normally filled with let's say 30 or 40 lines of people's addresses, and all of a sudden there's a bunch that's filled with Base64 encoded information, that might be pretty suspicious. This is also good for just finding some software bugs. Understanding the language that the web shell is written in can be really important to understanding whether or not it's malicious. If you don't happen to have good understanding of the web shell that you found, consider tapping in someone either within your organization or externally that does understand that language if you need. And as an example of how this can play out, I dealt with some Perl web shells where it used the fopen function, where if you don't know Perl, if you put a pipeline in an open command, it will run things after that as a command line execution. That's something that's really easy to overlook if you don't understand Perl. It doesn't look inherently dangerous having that pipe there. So don't be afraid to tap in extra people as needed. A lot of hunting can go on in log files. This is something that might help you find the web shell in the first place. And like I said, it's hard to do because many systems generate a lot of logs, and being able to figure out both how to do the hunting and taking the time to look at what comes out of your hunting tools and weed out the false positives can take a lot of time. But if you need to be doing this, look for the appearance of a new URI that's never been there before. This may duplicate some of the file system monitoring, but if you have access to your SIM and you don't have access to the file system, this is one way that you can do it. It's also important to some web frameworks because what they get as far as the URI is not representative of what's stored on the file system. So by examining both, you can get better information. You can also look for NuGet variables, but unless you have a very small, simple system, keeping track of everything that's legitimate and not can be a tremendous amount overhead. So it's probably not very realistic to do that unless you're hunting for something very specific. Another thing to look for in log files is URIs that have requests from just a single or handful of IP addresses. Unless this is a normal pattern for you, that's pretty suspicious. It's especially suspicious if they're coming from an international country where you don't normally get requests from known VPN or proxies, or from Tor IPs. One other thing you can look for related to this is occasionally robot.sat text will be modified to exclude the web shell, so keep an eye out for changes to it. You can look for new 4 or 500 errors appearing within log files. This could be a mistake made by programmers, it could be a mistake made by some of the users, but it can also help flag a suspicious thing that's being used by an inexperienced web shell operator. A 400 error might indicate that there's a problem in how they made the request. The application itself could have gotten into the system fine, they're just not calling it correctly. A 500 would indicate something on the application is going wrong. Either there's a bug in the code, or for example with PHP you can ban certain functions, and it might be calling one of those banned functions. This is a good practice to do in general, just to expose not even security vulnerabilities, but bugs to developers. Having a process that just goes through your log files and finds big spurts of new 400 or 500 errors can be really useful. There's a concept in programming of code smells, of things that you see in the code that may not be absolutely terrible in and of themselves, but when you see them, tends to indicate that something not so great is going on underneath the covers. I think there's a similar idea in log files, various things that may not be absolutely terrible or unusual in and of themselves, but if they're not what you're used to, or if you start seeing them together, is kind of suspicious. If there's Base64 encoded data within your GET requests, and that's not something that your developers usually do, that's pretty suspicious. If there's repeated visits to the same URI with different request and response links, and it's not something like a search engine, that could indicate that it's something suspicious going on, that they're running different commands that have different responses. So everything from dumping a database to looking at local file systems to attempting to get user files. If there's IP addresses making requests that never ever load JavaScript, CSS, images, fonts, etc., that's kind of suspicious. You're going to detect a lot of bots with this, but most of the tools are used to manipulate web shells don't do a great job of faking being a human either. So this may not be something you use immediately to find the web shell, but once you have an incident going on, you might use it to start looking for other web shells. This is completely obvious, but if there's command line things that are not expected coming across in a get variable or what have you, there's no good reason for ls-l to be appearing in most get variables, for example. That's immediately suspicious. If there's posts to file types that shouldn't be getting them, such as images, either your programmers are doing something that's a little bit out of spec with HTTP, or they might have remapped images to be executed by the web application server, and they're using that to try to fly underneath the radar. There's unusual spikes in activity, particularly when it's coming from 1 or 2 new IP addresses. That's pretty suspicious. Very often when they drop a web shell, they're going to start doing a lot of enumeration exploration of the system. So they're going to hit that one URI again and again and again and again. Unusual user agents can stand out. Some of the times they use, especially when you're working against it, for an adversary, they may have the language taken from their version of the web browser as the default. So that going to something when it's not something, if you don't have a lot of Russian customers and all of a sudden a Russian user agent is visiting just one or two parts of your website, you might want to look into that. And also refer header, again, this is not necessarily suspicious in and of itself, but you can use it in conjunction with some of the others to start finding something that's automated. You can also do threat hunting for web shells using network analysis. And all of this generally applies to what you'd be doing for any type of compromise. But if a web server starts unexpectedly reaching out to other servers within the DMZ or reaching back into the internal network in a way that's unusual, have some kind of netflow tool or what have you to detect that. If your web server doesn't normally connect to an internal site using HTTP, as I mentioned earlier, sometimes you get cases where they will start pivoting around using multiple web shells within internal networks. That could be something that's very suspicious. I mentioned earlier that TLS termination is an issue and that you might want to have a WAF if you're particularly worried about web shells. This is something that you can do on the network level to start detecting web shells. They can start pulling apart some of those Base64 encoded variables and start looking at them in a way that some of the other tools can't or don't. Endpoint anomaly detection can also be useful for hunting for web shells. Look for unusual child processes for the web server. So if Apache has Bash running underneath it, or IIS has command.exe running underneath it, that's pretty suspicious. Look for specific web server processes with unusually high CPU utilization or that run unusually long. If most of your applications terminate within 6 to 8 seconds and all of a sudden you have them being killed because they're hitting the 5-minute limit or what have you, that merits some investigation. Again, you might just be finding a bug and helping the developers find something that missed the quote quality checks, but you might be finding a web shell. Look for sudden increases in disk utilization. The attackers very often will stage information to a web server for download, so the web server itself will start filling up. Look for indications of log file tampering, trying to cover over what they did. This isn't necessarily specific to web shells, so it's a good practice, part of practice for threat hunting in general. And like I said previously, look for changes in net flow, things that are unusual as far as what it's connecting to. Before we go on to some actual hunting for web shells and using them, I wanted to talk about some defensive practices. Work with your developers, encourage them to follow best practices. Avoid the functions that are very dangerous, the ones that are used for things like executing shell commands that there's not really a lot of good reasons for a professional environment to be using. If you can make sure that they're not using them, when they do appear on the system, that will help them stick out as malicious. Write the files when possible outside of the web root. Don't use remote file inclusion, that sort of thing. You have to know what's normal within your environment. If you start looking for anomalous activity during an incident and you don't know what goes on a day-to-day basis, you're going to have a really bad time. Make sure that both you at a personal level and that the organization in general knows what is and isn't normal. It will make your hunting a whole lot easier. If possible, make the web root immutable. In general, especially with the scripting-based languages, if they can't write it, they're just stopped dead in their tracks. Use network segmentation to limit the damage that can be done from a compromised web server. Again, they're trying to get into your organization using these. So if you can limit through extreme firewall restraint or that kind of thing, what that web server can talk to, they may get what's on that web server itself, and that's not ideal, but they can't start getting into your internal network and doing some serious damage. And in general, push for a stronger vulnerability management program. As noted by the NSA, these attackers are often going off after these softer, weaker, less well-patched systems on the inside because they know that there's not great vulnerability management on them. So if you can help the entire program step up in general, that's going to help prevent internal targets from getting breached using these.